Thank you very much, Jack. Because there was 3 of us preparing this, I have 3 main things to try and squeeze in the next 20 minutes or so. I need to explain something of the background of the work that we've been doing at the National Museum, not just through the GLENMORANGIE project, but also through my colleague Fraser Hunter's work on late Roman silver and his forthcoming publication about the Trappane Law Hoard. That led us on to work that has been done through the GLENMORANGIE research project on a related set of material, other pieces of silver from the Norris Law Hoard. And people have always tried to connect these 2 hoards together, but they represent 2 quite different things, or so we thought. The Trappane Law Hoard is late Roman silver, and the Norris Law Hoard has always been considered early medieval silver. And one of the things that we're trying to get to is the relationship between these 2. I also need to tell you a little bit about the recent discovery of Scotland's 2nd early medieval hack silver hoard at Gaulcross. These are the 3 surviving items from the original discovery in 1838, but we've been back to the site with Gordon Noble and the University of Aberdeen's Northern Picts project. And then I'll tell you a little bit about what we plan to do with all of this. So the relationship between GLENMORANGIE and the National Museum, I won't go into any great detail, but the crux of it is that they did a rebranding exercise, and on all of their bottles now you will see this spiral panel, and it's inspired by the spiral panel on the Hilton of Cadboll cross slab, which is one of the centerpieces of the early people gallery in the National Museum of Scotland. Hilton of Cadboll was land that was under ownership of the GLENMORANGIE company, so that creates the relationship between the artefact, the company, and the museum that now houses it. The late Roman silver book that was published by the Society is a product of years of work by my colleague Fraser Hunter and a team of international specialists who are looking at, who are all specialists in late Roman silver, and they're working on the full publication of the Trappane Law Hoard. So we're very much building on a bedrock of research that has been ongoing for much longer than the GLENMORANGIE project. So, things that I want you to bear in mind for the rest of the talk are that, as far as we know, the source of all of the silver in early medieval Scotland is late Roman hack silver, so very similar to the material that we were fortunate to survive from Trappane Law. As far as we know, silver isn't mined at this point in Scotland. So once the silver supply is cut off from the Roman Empire, over the next 4 centuries, we think we're looking at a period where silver is a diminishing resource up until the Viking Age, when new sources of continental silver start coming into Scotland. But during that period, as silver becomes this diminishing resource, it's still of great social importance, and it seems to be used to express status. It seems to be used for some of the grandest objects that survive from this period. So Fraser and his team have been doing some analysis of the silver. Late Roman silver is very high quality. It's up to the standard that modern silver quality is. So roughly it's about 90 to 95% pure. The way that you can then look at it is you're looking at that other 5 to 10%, and it can give you, looking at those other minor elements that are residual within the silver, can give you, again, to use the phrase that Claire used earlier, a sort of chemical signature or a chemical fingerprint. So Fraser was doing some analysis of the Trappane Law silver, and because it's very high quality silver, the minor elements are almost negligible. So here we've got, we're comparing zinc and gold, and we're talking, less than 1%, less than 0.5% of zinc, and up to 1% of gold that can be left residually within the silver. And this helps us characterise very clearly late Roman silver. So the blue dots are pieces of trap-in-law that were analysed at a lab in Paris. They took along about a dozen pieces of the Norreys law hoard just to create a compare and contrast. And sure enough, the what we might think of as Pictish or early medieval silver from the Norreys law hoard looks different. It clusters in a different part of the table. It has a bit more zinc in it, maybe not so much gold. And this allows us to create a sort of clear distinction between the two. One of the little surprises is the two dots down there, which were pieces of Norreys law that turn out to be late Roman silver. One of those pieces of silver had been known about for some time because it was a recognisable piece of late Roman spoon, but the other bit was a bit of a surprise. So it set up a proposition for us to explore. This is all of the fragments that survive from the Norreys law hoard. It was discovered in 1819. We think less than a kilogram survives at the moment, and we think this is probably only about a 1/12 of what was originally discovered. It was spirited off, sold to silversmiths, and the bulk of it was melted down. These are bits that were collected by the local landowner after the fact, and 30, 40 years later they came to the National Collection. There has always been a lot of focus on this pair of handpins and this pair of plaques. The pair of plaques especially have Pictish symbols on them, and that, along with the general poorer quality of the silver, has meant that it's been characterised as early medieval silver, something different to the late Roman silver and the recognisable late Roman objects that we see in the trap-in-law hoard. One other thing to mention is that the site, Norreys Law, isn't a hill fort like Trap-in-law, but Norreys Law is a prehistoric monument, possibly a Bronze Age cairn, that this silver seems to have been buried at, presumably about 1,000 years later. So, with the impetus from Fraser's late Roman silver project and that little insight that there might be a few more bits of late Roman silver in the Norreys law hoard, we set off doing our own analysis. In the museum we can do surface XRF analysis, which gets that chemical signature from the surface of the silver object itself. So we used the same sort of parameters. We looked for the minor elements within the silver, things like zinc and gold, because we knew that that could give us the pattern that we were looking for. And again, a group of material, much more than we expected, plotted out as late Roman silver. So again, this is bringing the relationship between the Norreys law hoard and the Trap-in law hoards that little bit closer together. These are the items that we picked out. We wouldn't have been able to pick them out by eye as late Roman silver, apart from the fragment of silver spoon that Robert Stevenson recognised in the 1950s. So this has set up our basic research question, which is what is the relationship between late Roman silver and early medieval silver? And that's what the GLENMORANGIE project will be hoping to explore over the next 3 years. We had already set about a process of trying to widen the context of looking at early medieval silver. One of the products of the analysis that we were doing, that I just showed you the graph from, is that we unfortunately discovered that one of the plaques and one of the pins from the Norreys law hoard were fakes. Victorian fakes that came about in that gap when bits of it were being melted down and before it was first reported. So what this does is it really sort of reduces the Pictish or the local component. We now have only one object in the Norreys law hoard with Pictish symbols on it, and yet look at the wealth of material that it's surrounded by. So one of the ways that we set about trying to think about a much wider context for this material, well, the easiest one to look at is silver handpins. This is the silver handpin from the one that we know is the original from the Norreys law hoard. It doesn't have the Z rod on the back of it that the fake does, it has this very typical small punched decoration. On the front would have been the beautiful enhanced with red enamel spiral decoration. So if we think about where silver handpins are found, Trappin Law, which again gives us a nice connection. We know that there was one from the Gaulcross Hoard, there's one up at Fresick Links, a couple in the central island, and then a scatter of them down in what would have been, we presume, 5th century, 6th century post-Roman England. There's also one that we came across recently from the continent, a place called Hallam Turp, which again makes us think we shouldn't be just looking at Britain and Ireland, we should be thinking about this material as part of early medieval Europe, Scotland's place within early medieval Europe. If we think about sort of related material, previous work by Andy Heald had done something very similar, looking at doorknob spear butts. Again, you see a similar sort of scatter down south, a good scatter in Ireland, but key to this is manufacturing evidence in Scotland, in the Western Isles, the Northern Isles, Trappin Law. If you plot the production evidence for handpins, you would come up with something very similar. There are handpin moulds from the Northern Isles, the Western Isles, and Trappin Law. So one of the things we can start to do to widen out the context is to look at the techniques. So again, what we know is the authentic handpin from Norreys Law. We can see similar sort of techniques, these small annulets punched on the back to create panels. They're quite often grouped into threes. And we can look at Irish material like this large disc-headed pin from the Londesborough collection. And one of the fragments from the Norreys Law Hoard has a similar type of decoration on it. So we can use the classic sort of art historical method looking for techniques of decoration. Or we can try to track some of the types of object. So a spiral fingering from Norreys Law, again we have an example from Trappin Law, and two that seem to have been votively deposited at the much older site of Newgrange, the Neolithic complex in Central Ireland, but these were deposited with late Roman material. We could think about technology and manufacturing techniques. Amongst all those fragments of silver, there are things that have been made in different ways, and we might be able to trace some of that technology into other items. So again, an Irish parallel is these large bronze discs from, well, a couple are from Monasterevan, they're termed Monasterevan type discs, and they use similar types of repoussé technique to hammer out these high relief spirals. When you take out those decorated objects and try to look at the material without sort of art historical lens on, there is still a wealth of material in the Norreys Law Hoard to consider. Quite a lot of those fragments are what look like armlets or bracelets or bangles. So we have a whole group of fragments of these things, including some terminals that have this sort of lobed effect to a circular plate. Again, we can find an Irish parallel, again in bronze. They're using enamel here to enhance that circular terminal. And as well as the handpin from Gaulcross, there was also, at that point we knew that there was a spiral armlet from the Gaulcross Hoard. Amongst other fragments, we can start to piece things together from Norreys Law. So this is several bits that we can put together because they've got this circular residual mark on it and scratched cross. And we think that this might link to this boss trim section, because we've found a parallel, again, sort of late 5th, early 6th century Merovingian and Anglo-Saxon graves sometimes have these bostrom bowls, and the key characteristics are quite often this circular feature at the base with the cross on it and the faint bostrom here. So we think that we might have, again, a silver example of something that we know survives elsewhere in bronze. So what we're trying to do with this exercise, and we'll be doing a lot more of it in the future, is to try and widen out the context. Think about this material that's found in Scotland, but in terms of what it means for early medieval Europe. One of the things that's come out of the work that Fraser has been doing is bringing together people that are interested in this phenomenon of hack silver, how the silver from the Roman world is then being reused by surrounding and later societies. And one of the things that intrigued us was that in Denmark you wouldn't have this distinction between late Roman and early medieval. They look at it much more as a continuum, partly because they've got a lot more hoards to look at. As far as we knew, we only had two, Trappane Law and Norris Law, so we thought it might be nice to find some more. And this is where my colleague Gordon Noble comes in. He has a very active fieldwork project, the Northern Picts, which I'm sure some of you have heard a lot about. We set off to have a look at Gaulcross because the spiral armlet and the handpin gave us that connection with the Norris Law hoard, but as far as we knew, we didn't have hack silver. We only had these three intact objects that had survived, the handpin being the key connection with Norris Law. But the report of how it was discovered is very similar to the Norris Law hoard. It was 1838, agricultural improvement in a field that had two large prehistoric monuments in it. They're dynamiting, it looks like there are cobble ring cairns, they're pulling those apart, and in the process they discover an early medieval silver hoard. They describe brooches, buckles, pins, but only 3 items survived. So again, the connection, thinking about what got us here, there's Norris Law in Fife, key sites I've been mentioning, Trappane Law in East Lothian, and Gaulcross in Aberdeenshire. We were lucky that the first edition recorded where these two stone circles were that had been destroyed in 1838. So that gave us a place to focus on. We started doing geophysics to see if we could pick up the signs of the stone circles, but the improvement, either the improvement in the 19th century or the ploughing regime since, seems to have destroyed all signs of these. But we were able to use the OS plot to get us into the right place. Geophysics didn't work, but the second day, the metal detector Alistair McPherson that was working with us started hitting tiny bits of silver right away. It wasn't a great time of year to do it. It was snowing, but we only had a week because it was deep ploughing, potato planting in the field was going to happen the following week. So we got a machine in and we started to slowly pick up the plot. We picked an area where we were getting the most silver signatures, and then we started to remove it in spits. And this method seemed quite it seemed to work quite well, because as the depth increased, we started to pick up more and more finds. And the last spit that we did before the subsoil, we doubled the number of silver finds that we had. We ended up with a plot like this. This is where we think the location of the two stone circles were, and between is a good scatter, quite a broad scatter of silver material. The surface, the subsoil surface, was very heavily scarred. We didn't find a single piece of silver in a subsoil feature, so we don't have an original context. The original description of the find is that they're pulling the cairn apart, and just below the surface they discovered the hoard. And what I think has happened is that they began pulling it apart, and they must have scattered a bunch of small fragments, and it's only once they found some large intact pieces that they started then collecting it up. And then I think the subsequent ploughing regime has gave us this much more scattered distribution. So what did we find? We didn't expect, we hoped, but we did find what look very much like hack silver packages, very similar to some of the packages from Trappane Law. We've also got ingots. This is one that was broken, found in 2 separate places, and fits back together lovely. Some of the items were intact, like these decorated mounts here. Others were obviously hacked. There were some unusual items, things that we wouldn't necessarily recognise as Pictish or even late Roman silver. We're still looking for parallels for some of these objects. But some of the objects we do have very good parallels for. So previously this type of twisted penannular hoop from the Norreys Law Hoard was unique. It was only known from Norreys Law Hoard, but just to excite us a little bit more, on the first day we got a hacked fragment of a terminal of one of these penannular hoops. Again, thinking about what's lurking in all of the fragments of Norreys Law Hoard, all those pieces of armlet, we were getting very similar bits from Gaulcross, and some of the decorated pieces, again, are looking very reminiscent. In the folded up bangles, we were again very lucky. Some of them had late Roman coins, the very latest Roman silver coins that are circulating in Britain, pinched in the folds. Some of them are folded up into really tight little packages, and I don't know if we sort of mentally unravel this, whether you might end up with a spiral armlet like the 19th century surviving one from Gaulcross. More late Roman material again than we were expecting, so hacked up dishes, things that we might be able to liken to material in the Trappane Law Hoard. Late Roman militaria, which is something that you do get belt fittings in the Trappane Law Hoard, and a good scatter of the latest Roman clipped siliquy, which are probably circulating into the first half of the 5th century. There was a report of coins that were found with the Norreys Law Hoard, and unfortunately they don't survive, but in our previous research we had come across a drawing, a Society of Antiquaries album, where the author had very carefully illustrated the same types of coins. So you can see that these are clipped siliquy, they're starting to remove the legend, getting very close to the head of the emperor there. So we can say that Norreys Law Hoard had the same types of coins that are found at Gaulcross, similar types of coins that are found at Trappane Law. So what next? Well, we've got a whole new hoard to look at, but also the real joy of this is that it allows us to look at this material as the Danes do. We've now got one more dot on the map, but we've got a wealth of material that has relationships with the Norreys Law Hoard and the Trappane Law Hoard, and we can look at this as a suite of material, a continuum of silver use and reuse. So this is Alice Blackwell, my colleague, the GLENMORANGIE Research Fellow. She'll be doing most of the work, analysing and cataloguing. The Norreys Law Hoard has never been published, so this seems like the perfect opportunity to publish Norreys Law and Gaulcross together, and hopefully that will be one of the outputs of the next phase of the project. We need to identify some of these mystery objects. We need to carry on with our surface analysis, see what type of material there is here, how much late Roman silver, how much it's then being recycled and reused, and what sort of new scheme we can come up with to think about the centuries following late Roman, the Trappane Law Hoard, and how silver is being reused after that. We'll be able to look again at Norreys Law and start piecing things together, comparing the packages that we're getting from the Gaulcross Hoard. Most of Norreys Law has been unfolded at some point and cracked, and so we'll be able to hopefully piece some of these things together. So this is an early result that we've had where you can put 3 pieces together that have a variety of folds. You know, it's not always the most obvious fold that tells you which way these things are going, but there are also alternating punch marks at the top and the bottom of this that, as if you can imagine, it's sort of concertinaing together, and then somebody hammering top and bottom to keep it pinched together. So we can pick up little signs like this, help us think about the Norreys Law Hoard in a different way. We need to think a little bit more about Trappane law. Yes, it has this massive hoard of late Roman silver, but it also has silver spiral fingering, it has hand pins, there is even a strange bronze plaque we've come across which is very similar to the Norreys law one, and of course something that an object type that really tells us about the amount of silver that was available in Scotland in the centuries following the late Roman world. These silver chains, we're going to be able to look at these again, complete surface analysis of them, and maybe try and pinpoint where in our sort of vague chronology of early medieval Scotland where these objects occur. One of the things that I would say is we already had a sort of concept that if silver is a diminishing resource over 3 or 4 centuries, this looks like the immediate centuries following late Roman Britain, where silver is more heavily available. So we might think of it in terms of quantity and quality. There is a quantity of silver available here in maybe the 7th and 8th centuries. That, from what we know, the quality is diminishing, and we have to think more about the relationship between silver and other materials, gold, bronze, gem settings, and the more sort of jeweller's arts to create a different type of artistic quality. So hopefully we'll be expanding the research into that later period as well. All of this hopefully will help us think about some of our stereotypes of early medieval Scotland, getting away from the savage Picts and thinking more about the sophistication, the technology, and the wealth of material that we have at our disposal. So thank you very much. I have to obviously say thank you to GLENMORANGIE, who make this research possible, but also partnership with Gordon Noble and the Northern Picts Project.